Hello and welcome to My Finance Teacher. I hope you guys are having a nice weekend, and today I want to have a look at a likelihood of a severe market crash, given that over the last several months S&P 500 has already lost around 20% of its value. And I'm going to look at this likelihood by considering all the cases when S&P 500 on the monthly chart has closed below the 12-month moving average or an annual moving average. This again is a monthly chart of S&P 500 during 1970s and 1980s. The blue arrows indicate all the instances when on the monthly chart S&P 500 closed below that 12-month moving average. Out of all those instances, of which there are quite many, I want to have a look at the cases when this close below the 12-month moving average was actually part of a relatively large decline in S&P 500. Let's say anywhere above 20%. A drop of 20% or more is one way of looking at what is a bear market. So let's have a look at this likelihood of experiencing a severe bear market, given that S&P 500 has not really performed well over the last several months. Now, looking at this period in 1970s and 1980s, there were actually 8 instances when S&P 500 on the monthly chart closed below the 12-month moving average. But not all of those 8 instances were part of a relatively severe decline of 20% or more. There were actually only 2 of them. In 1973, where during 2 years S&P 500 lost about 49% of its value. In early 1980s, where in 1.5 years or so S&P 500 lost about 27% of its value. Here's an example in late 1970s of a relatively severe decline as well, but it didn't reach the 20% threshold that I'm going to apply in this video. But nevertheless, I point out to this decline on the chart, since it's relatively close to that threshold. And the third instance in those 2 decades was in late 1980s, where S&P 500 dropped about 34% in only about half a year or so. Next, we are moving on to 1990s and 2000s. Again, during those 2 decades, there were 5 instances when S&P 500 on the monthly chart closed below the 12-month moving average. Out of those 5 instances, S&P 500 dropped by 20% or more 4 times. In 1990, S&P 500 dropped by about 20% in half a year. In late 90s, it lost about 22% in half a year. In early 2000s, it lost around 50% in a couple of years. And of course, in late 2000s, it lost around 58% in a year and a half. More recently, since 2010, there were 4 instances when S&P 500 closed below the 12-month moving average. Out of those 4 instances, it dropped by 20% or more in 2 of the cases. In 2011, it dropped by about 22% in half a year, and over the last several months, it dropped by about 20%. Altogether, over the last 50 years or so, S&P 500 closed below the 12-month moving average 17 times. And out of those 17 times, not every time S&P 500 has actually lost a lot of value. It only lost 20% or more in 8 out of 17 times. So I'm not counting this case in late 1970s, where it lost 19% only. If we do count this sort of a borderline case, that would make it 9 out of 17 times when S&P 500 has actually suffered quite a significant loss. In all of those 8 times when the losses were relatively significant, the average loss was around 34%. So the probability of a significant loss is around 50%, 8 out of 17. And on average, this significant loss was around 34%. Given that so far over the last several months we've only dropped about 20%, it means that there is some sort of downside risk at the moment. However, there is also some sort of a upside potential as well, I think, as there are many instances when a drop below 12-month moving average was later followed by a considerable increase in S&P 500. And given that the US economy does not seem to experience any sort of a recession at the moment, I bet that S&P 500 does not break below 2300, say, over the next several months. In fact, over the next 2 or 3 months, I expect S&P 500 to close above its 12-month moving average. Remember, this is not investment advice and you have to make your own decisions, but I do support my bet with my own money I keep. I still keep the QQQs, the triple Qs, which I bought at an average price of around 161, and the current price is about 165. So I'm only into a very, very modest, slight gains on that trade. So that is my opinion. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Are we going to see a retest of the recent lows on S&P 500? I do read all of the comments as I'm quite interested in your opinion. And remember to hit the like under this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Again, have a nice weekend.